Hello, and welcome to the first of our Wednesday Pause for Thought during this coronavirus crisis. A long time ago, I was vicar in Norfolk parish where there was a Carmelite monastery. It housed people who chose to isolate themselves from the rest of the world. One of them self-isolated most of the time. You may have heard of her or seen her on television, Sister Wendy. I've been in touch with that community now for a very long time and have learned more than a lot, especially from one of the sisters there, whom I would call a friend. Norwich is famous for another person who has isolated themselves, Julian of Norwich. She lived in the late 14th century through terrible times. The bishop actually had his own army to protect himself and his property, and used it to put down the peasants' revolt. Not the most sympathetic or popular man in the world. In a plague in Norwich, it's estimated that out of a population of 25,000, just 6,000 people survived. Only a third of the clergy lived on. Julian knew that the people around felt maybe like us, that they were in the grip of forces they could not control, and those forces were malign. Julian was a hermit. She spent most of her time alone, yet not completely cut off from the world around, a bit like being self-isolated. She was visited by people who brought her food, and some came for advice. No doubt all kept the 2-metre rule. But really, the idea of cutting yourself off deliberately strikes most people as a waste. Certainly some of the locals in Norfolk express that sentiment about the monastery in their midst. Perhaps that's why people like me actually resent the need to self-isolate in this present emergency. It makes us feel unimportant or even useless. The fact is, when you meet people who deliberately cut themselves off from others, you discover that far from denying life, it enables them to live more fully. I like to think of it as St. Paul does when he describes the church as being made up of many different kinds of people, all dependent upon one another. Each contributes to the whole. Some make up for what others are unable or even unwilling to do. And it strikes me that many people just now are doing exactly that, making up for those of us who are out of action. Perhaps you're one of them, so please accept my thanks along, I'm sure, with the thanks of many other people too. Julian fell very ill when she was 30. She expected to die and was given up for dead. But in her illness she had a number of visions, many of which were of Jesus on the cross. She was rather shy of writing them down. She actually claimed to be unlettered, feeble and frail. My suspicion is she was probably as sharp as a knife and as tough as old boots. In those days, the 14th century, it was probably thought that writing about theology was a man's business, not for women at all. However, the visions are not an easy read for us modern people, but she does have some remarkable things to say. In times when people were fighting all the time and very rigid, dogmatic in their opinions, Julian's visions tell her of a God of love for all people without exception. She has a vision of the whole world caught up in the love of God. She can be very brave for the time and describe God as mother. Perhaps that's brave to do that even these days. In another vision, she holds a hazelnut in her hand. She notes how wonderfully made it is, how small it is. It seems that such a beautiful thing cannot be without value. She writes, "In this little thing I saw three properties. The first is that God made it, the second is God loves it, the third is God preserves it." So she finds people the same, beautifully made, wonderfully created, cared for. Each must be of value. Well, feeling rather sorry for myself and rather useless in self-isolation, small and of little value, I try to hang on to the actual experience of my friends at Quiddenham, give myself over to more meditative things to do, and take comfort from what Julian of Norwich discovered in her isolation. I'm certainly grateful that so many people take the same attitude towards their fellow human beings. They actually care for them, they preserve them, they look after them. And I'm glad that our church in these trying times is practicing what it preaches.